Hi everyone, this is Andrew Prima, Ukrainian American, living and reporting from Ukraine. I'm a founder of Ukraine Business News, reporting from the front lines of the Ukrainian war with Russia. In today's podcast, the 13th week of war in Ukraine, we will cover the following updates from the front lines, in particular Donbas battle, and the world grain crisis that started from the blockage of Black Sea ports in Ukraine. Front lines. Let's see what happened in the last week. Russian troops continued the offensive in the Bakhmut town, the Donetsk region. The offensive is going very slowly due to the resistance of Ukrainian troops, but the slow push of our defense continues. The occupiers have been trying for a week to break through the defense of the armed forces of Ukraine and intercept in the Bakhmut Lysychansk route. Russian troops maneuver freely on the front and have the ability to withdraw troops from other areas where they stopped offensive campaigns in order to concentrate forces in areas where they want to advance. The enemy is also tired and no longer uses large scale attacks, trying to solve tactical tasks by concentrating artillery and air strikes. Russian troops passed on the Bakhmut Lysychansk highway near the villages of Nagirne and Belogorivka. Why it's important? Because this is the key highway that allows our troops to be supplied with all the weaponry, food, and gas. The second day of fighting is the area was very tough. In just 7 days, the enemy has been trying to break through our defense and intercept the route. The enemy seeks to consolidate and expand the zone of breakthrough. If the enemy can gain a foothold, it will mean an operational encirclement of our troops in the district of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. Our troops in those regions will hold their ground, and all attempts at daily attacks on these regions have been repulsed with heavy losses of Russian troops. Our soldiers are not gonna surrender the Luhansk region. Russian troops, units of 76th Airborne Assault Division, continue their attempt to break through the Bakhmut-Lysychansk route on a wider front. Ukrainian soldiers in the Donbass are making every effort to defeat Russian strike groups and thwart the plans of Russian army. Russians are suffering heavy losses. The situation little by little getting worse. So the situation remains difficult and shows signs of further aggravation. The enemy used all forces and means to capture our territory and surround our troops. The fighting has reached its maximum intensity so far. The enemy is storming the positions of our troops in several directions at the same time. That was said by Deputy Minister of Defense of Ukraine. We have an extremely difficult and long stage of struggle ahead of us, and we must understand that this is a war, and unfortunately, losses on our part are inevitable. According to the Deputy Minister of Defense, the aggressor is carrying out intensive fire along the entire line of contact and in the depth of the defense of Ukrainian troops in the Donetsk operational area, using tactical missile systems, aircrafts, and artillery. The beginning of this summer will be very difficult. The enemy still has a lot of weapons, and the next few weeks will be very difficult, wrote on Twitter the Secretary of National Security Defense Council of Ukraine, Danilov. According to him, the aggressor country has changed its tactics, concentrating troops and attacking the territories of Donetsk and Luhansk regions, planning to reach the administrative borders. The Russians take the fire shaft and the number follow one another, not counting the losses. Many military analysts assess the situation in north of Luhansk region as a critical. We have previously withdrawn our troops to other lines of defense in order to preserve the armed forces. This is the main task. The only thing is that the political situation might worsen, in the sense that Russia will wave a flag and shout that it has fulfilled at least some of the political tasks that Putin set for the Russian army forces. If our capabilities allow us to survive and maintain these boundaries, then we must remain there and defend ourselves. But if the situation is critical, then leave. Now, there are reports that Russian troops are marching on their own corpses. No one is cleaning up the dead and destroyed equipment, and they, just between them and the bodies, go to the next attack of our positions. There is a really horror, and they do not stop the assault on our positions. Regarding the struggle for the Bakhmut Lysychansk road, it can be called the road of life, and I will explain you why. Because this highway is the one of the ways. I mean, it's not the main one, but that's not the only one, but that's the main one. But it is the main one that uh, provides the supplying of weapon and gas and food to our troops in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk towns. And this is the hottest spot of Donetsk region. Along the way, we supply munition, fuel, and food for our troops. That is why this road is extremely important, said the Minister of Defense of Ukraine. Russian troops have not blocked the road yet, but they are shooting at it with various weapons, so it is dangerous to operate. The Russians use scorched earth tactics, as we see, in particular in the example of Rubizhny town. Only the United States fought in the world in Vietnam in the 1960s, and Russia adopted this tactic from the Second Chechen War. They lost the First Chechen War with a bang, then they went the way of scorched earth. That is, when troops launch an offensive or attack, if they encounter any resistance, they roll back and call in artillery or aircraft. And so they summon artillery and aircraft as many times as the resistance stops or is weak enough for them to attack our positions. The Russians take the fire shaft and the number follow one another, not counting the losses. They can break through our defenses that don't have enough forces. We fight much better. But with such a barrage of fire and constant influx of personnel and equipment, they're simply squeezing us out of our positions, step by step. British intelligence has released a report on the heavy losses among Russia's elite airborne troops, who died in the beginning of this war in Kiev region, in Gostomel, in the Izum direction, is in Donetsk region, and while crossing the Seversky Donets River. The British are absolutely right. We have actually leveled the airborne troops, as such a very effective kind of armed forces of the Russian Federation. The fact is that we didn't allow them to conduct any successful landing operations, and then they were forced to use the landing as a more prepared part of their armed forces, as ordinary infantry. And then, when the first airborne troops which deployed there died, there were almost 100% of contractors had experience of landing, experience of special operations in various countries, including hotspots in combat. When we destroyed the first, most effective, and experienced ones, today there are actually young guys who have served just a little and not familiar with serving at the front lines. They are no longer the landing troops. In fact, it can be stated that they have become ordinary infantry and they are used. Although airborne troops never, even in the combat training, do not go through the subject of attacking the object as it attacks the infantry. In occupied territories, Russia has started issuing Russian passports. Putin is wasting paper. No one will ever recognize the forced issuance of Russian passports to residents of the occupied territories of Kherson and Zaporizhia regions of Ukraine. The head of European delegation in Kiev, Mati Miasikas, in his Twitter noted that Kremlin was forced to abandon the idea of holding a referendum in the occupied territories, deciding to replace it with the certification of the population. On May 24th, Putin signed a decree simplifying the issuance of Russian passports to residents of Zaporizhia and Kherson regions. After Mariupol, Azovstal had no choice but surrender to Russian forces for exchanging for Russian military prisoners, Russia took over the whole city of Mariupol and setting up their own government. As you might heard in the last podcast, we talk about the 2,000 Azovstal defenders who surrendered to Russians in order to save their lives. So as of today, 2,000 Azovstal defenders are in Russian occupied territories, held in prisons, and waiting for the Russian side to agree to exchange them as it was agreed before agreeing to surrender. Mariupol is being prepared for the Russian measure. In the city of Mariupol, the Russian occupiers announced the extension of the school year until September 1st, and the main goal of Russian is de-Ukrainization and preparation for the school year according to the Russian program. Children will be taught Russian language and Russian literature, Russian history and mathematics in Russian language only. So as you see, Russians want just to erase Ukrainian nation, Ukrainian culture, and Ukrainian language from this earth. The owner of the Azovstal, where our defenders uh, was defending the territory for 3 months, is ready to sue Russian for billions of dollars because the Azovstal plant was completely destroyed. At the replacement cost of the loss of Mariupol plants due to Russian aggression, the losses are around between 17 and 20 billion dollars. The final amount will be determined in a lawsuit against Russia, said the owner of Azovstal, Rinat Akhmetov. As of today the world politics play an important role and help Ukraine to fight the evil. Ukraine is expecting European summit next week, which must make the right decisions. In the next couple of days, European Union will offer new weapons to Ukraine in confiscation of Russian assets. The journalist who had access to the draft proposal reported this 3 days ago on EU Observer publishing company. European countries, as they said, preparing a new package of military and financial assistance to Ukraine and proposal to strengthen sanctions against Russia. So, the European Union intends to continue to arm the armed forces of Ukraine. In addition, European leaders are ready to take legal action to confiscate Russian property in Europe in order to further use the frozen assets to rebuild Ukraine. The draft decision also sharply criticized the Kremlin blackmail against blocking Ukrainian grain exports, which could result in a global food crisis. So, as you remember, in the recent calculations, the damage that Russian Federation did to Ukraine amounts to $100 billion, and all the European countries, as well as United States and Canada, are frozen assets of Russian oligarchs and the Russian government, and planning to use this money to rebuild Ukraine. NATO role is huge in this conflict, as you know. Currently, NATO has two precautionary tasks. The alliance must now continue to support Ukraine and prevent the war from escalating, according to NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. NATO's first task is to provide long-term support. That is why I'm asking the allies to replenish their supplies, because this is more and more of war of attrition, Stoltenberg said. The second task is to prevent escalation. Our primary responsibility is to protect all our allies, the billion people living in NATO countries. The war in Ukraine is terrible and brutal, but if it escalates into a full-scale war between NATO and Russia, it will do much more damage, he added. According to the NATO chief, Putin made a big strategic mistake. He planned to achieve this goal within a week. It is now the 13th week of the war, and Russian troops have been driven out of Kiev, Kharkiv, to the north. However, Stoltenberg added that this war is unpredictable, and no one can say for sure when and how this war will end. Ukrainian army forces desperately need a heavy weapon, tanks, and military jets. However, there are informal agreements between NATO countries to refrain from supplying certain weapons systems to Ukraine, especially aircrafts and tanks. They say that the risk of direct military confrontation between NATO and the aggressor country of Russia should be as low as possible. There are fears in the alliance that the aggressor country could officially consider the supply of Western battle tanks and warplanes as entering the war, and thus take military action in response. Britain has been helping Ukraine a lot and has been dedicated to Ukrainian nation fully. Britain determined and shows dedication to Ukrainian nation and provides military and financial aid. Russia's aggression must be met with force and attempts to pacify the Kremlin dictator endangers, said the Britain Foreign Minister Liz Truss. We must be steadfast in securing Ukraine's victory with military aid and sanctions. Now we can't take our foot off the gas pedal, she said. The British minister intends to demand an increase in arms supplies to Ukraine and tougher sanctions against Russia. We must not allow a protracted and increasingly painful conflict to develop in Ukraine, she said. As you know, Russian Navy has been blocking seaports of Ukraine for the last 2.5 months, I would say almost 3 months. And because of that, many countries might be starving this year. Grain export import blockage in Ukraine has become not just Ukraine's, but the world's problem. More than 20 million tons of grain are in Ukrainian ports blocked by Russians at the start of this war. Ukraine and the allies are trying to resolve this issue and find a way to unblock the seaports. Russia demanded to lift sanctions to unblock Ukraine's seaports. The Kremlin blackmail failed. The United States rejected Russia's proposal to lift sanctions in exchange for unblocking access to Ukrainian ports, said Ned Price, a State Department spokesman. Of course, We will not lift sanctions in response to empty promises. We have heard empty promises from the Russian Federation before, and I think we have reason to be skeptical when we hear various promises and proposals from Russians, he added. The State Department spokesman called it appalling that Russia was seeking to use food and energy as weapons. So Ukraine speaking with its allies to find different ways how to move the grain out of the Ukrainian ports. So recently, Turkey offered a corridor. Ankara is in talks with Kiev and Moscow to open a corridor through Turkey for grain exports from Ukrainian ports. However, no agreement have not been reached. No agreement have been reached. Also, Baltic states offering to export the grain through the seaports, through their seaports, and delivering the grain by the railroad. Russian assets freezing is taking place all over the world. The European Union has frozen almost 25 billion in assets of Russian central bank, said Justice Commissioner Didier Reynders. Since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, about 25 billion euros have been blocked in the European Union, and this figure is much less than the 100 billion frozen by the United States. In addition, the official said European Union countries also froze tangible assets worth about 10 billion euros, including yachts and villas linked to oligarchs and Kremlin officials. As we can see, the world has united to beat the aggressor and dictator who wants to erase the nations from the earth. We must mobilize all our resources to end this war as soon as possible. The best, and perhaps the only way to save our civilization is to defeat Putin. Glory to Ukraine! Glory to Ukrainian defenders for protecting our land. Thank you, dear friends, for listening, and I hope you enjoyed my podcast. If you would like to support Ukraine Business News team, you can go to ubn.news and click the banner Support UBN. Thank you for listening.